In today's audiobook, we explore one of the most quietly misunderstood experiences of modern life, the slow, heavy entanglement of procrastination and depression, the heart of the quiet paralysis, how depression and procrastination feed each other, published by Stillness audiobooks. In these pages, we go beyond the surface, past the easy explanations and the well-meaning advice that never quite lands, inviting you to reflect deeply on what this theme truly means in your own life, in your own mornings, in your own silences. There is a particular kind of stillness that does not feel peaceful. It is the stillness of a person sitting at a desk with a list of things to do, watching the hours pass, feeling the weight of each undone task pressing gently but insistently against the chest. It is the stillness of someone who knows, with quiet certainty, that they are capable and yet cannot seem to begin. This is not laziness, this is not weakness, this is something far more layered, far more human, and far more worthy of honest exploration. Many people carrying this experience describe it in similar ways. A professional wakes before the alarm, already tired, already behind, already cataloguing everything that needs to happen and everything that did not happen yesterday. The morning unfolds not with energy, but with a kind of negotiation. Just 5 more minutes just after this, just once the feeling lifts. And the feeling does not lift. The day moves forward, and they move with it, but not through it. By evening, the list remains largely untouched, and the familiar companion of self-reproach settles in beside them, like an old unwelcome guest. What we will explore together in this audiobook is the reason why. Not the surface reason, not the distraction, not the poor time management, not the lack of discipline, but the deeper current running beneath all of it. We will examine how depression and procrastination are not two separate problems that happen to coincide, but two expressions of the same underlying experience, each one feeding the other in a cycle that can feel, from the inside, completely invisible. In Chapter 1, we will trace the roots of this cycle, where it begins, what conditions allow it to take hold, and why the mind so often mistakes paralysis for safety. In Chapter 2, we will move inward into the precise psychological mechanism that links low mood to delayed action and why the brain under emotional weight operates by entirely different rules. In Chapter 3, we will follow this experience into daily life, into the workplace, into relationships, into the quiet architecture of an ordinary day, and see how the cycle shapes everything it touches. In Chapter 4, we will illuminate the hidden patterns that keep the cycle running, the beliefs and internal narratives that sustain it long after the original wound has faded. In Chapter 5, we will explore the natural path towards something gentler, not a cure, not a formula, but a different way of relating to the self that makes movement possible again. And in Chapter 6, we will sit with what a transformed inner life actually looks and feels like, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living, breathing, imperfect reality. This is not a book of instructions. No one will ask you to do anything. This is an invitation to understand, because understanding in itself is one of the most quietly revolutionary acts available to a human being. Let us dive into the root of this, chapter by chapter. Before we begin, if this kind of contemplative audiobook speaks to something in you, consider following the Stillness Audiobooks channel. New original audiobooks arrive regularly, each one created for exactly this kind of deep, unhurried listening. Chapter 1. The Ground Beneath the Stillness. There is a question that rarely gets asked in honest conversations about procrastination. Not how to stop it, not how to overcome it, not which system or method might finally break the pattern, but simply, where does it come from? What is the actual ground in which this particular experience takes root? The common narrative places procrastination firmly in the category of habit and discipline. It is framed as a failure of willpower, a deficit of motivation, a character flaw wearing the polite mask of delay. And because this narrative is so widely accepted, so casually repeated, those who live inside the experience tend to absorb it as truth. They become, over time, people who believe they are fundamentally broken in some small but persistent way. people who know what they should do and simply do not do it, for reasons they cannot fully articulate. But this framing misses something essential. It misses the emotional architecture beneath the behavior. Because procrastination, in its deeper forms, does not begin with laziness. It begins with feeling. Specifically, it begins with the anticipation of discomfort, not the discomfort of the task itself, but the discomfort of what the task represents. The report that must be written is not simply a report. It is evidence in the anxious mind of potential judgment. The email that sits unanswered is not simply an email. It is a small arena in which something about the self might be confirmed or denied. This is where depression enters the picture, quietly, often long before it is recognized as depression. Many people who struggle with procrastination do not describe themselves as depressed. They describe themselves as tired, unmotivated, stuck. They speak of a low-grade flatness that has settled over everything, a muting of the colors of daily life that has been present for so long, they have begun to mistake it for personality. They are not lying. This is precisely how depression often announces itself in adults navigating demanding lives, not as a dramatic collapse but as a slow dimming. And within that dimming, the anticipation of discomfort grows louder. When the emotional baseline is low, everything requiring effort appears to the perceiving mind as requiring more effort than it actually does. A task that might take 30 minutes feels in the body like something requiring reserves that are simply not available. The gap between where one is and where one needs to be, emotionally, energetically, becomes a kind of silent measurement that runs in the background of every waking hour. Common human experience consistently reveals this pattern, that it is not the difficult tasks that are avoided first, but the meaningful ones, the project someone actually cares about, the conversation that actually matters, the creative work that carries something of the self inside it. These are avoided with particular persistence because the stakes of beginning, and perhaps failing, or perhaps succeeding and still feeling nothing, feel unnavigable. This is the ground beneath the stillness, not laziness, not weakness, a nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems do when they are carrying more than they were designed to carry alone, contracting, conserving, waiting for conditions that feel safer before committing to movement. Understanding this is not an absolution. It is something more useful than that. It is an accurate map, and an accurate map, even of difficult terrain, is always preferable to wandering without one. This naturally leads us to a deeper question, not where the cycle begins, but how it actually runs. What is the precise internal mechanism that transforms a low mood into a postponed life? Chapter 2. The mechanism of delay. If one were to observe the mind of someone caught between depression and procrastination, not from the outside with its visible symptoms and measurable behaviors, but from the inside, with full access to the texture of the experience, what one would find is not chaos. What one would find is a system operating with extraordinary consistency, following rules that make complete sense given the information available to it, even when those rules produce outcomes that the conscious mind recognizes as harmful. This is one of the most important things to understand about the relationship between low mood and delayed action. It is not irrational. It only appears irrational from the outside. From the inside, every delay has a logic. Every avoidance has a reason. And the mechanism running beneath it all is one of the most fundamental in human psychology, the management of anticipated pain. The mind, when operating under the weight of depression, becomes exquisitely sensitive to the possibility of failure. Not necessarily dramatic, catastrophic failure, but the small daily failures that accumulate into a story about who one is. The email sent and never answered. The deadline missed by a day. The meeting where one spoke and felt afterward that the words had come out wrong. These small events in an emotionally regulated state are processed and released. They become data points, not definitions. But in a depressed state, they become sticky. They accumulate. They begin to form a quiet but persistent narrative. That effort tends to lead to disappointment. That beginning tends to lead to falling short. That it might be safer, on balance, not to begin at all. This is the mechanism of delay in its essential form. It is the mind making a calculation, often completely below the level of conscious awareness, that the emotional cost of attempting and failing outweighs the emotional cost of not attempting. And here is what makes this mechanism so durable. In the short term, it is correct. Not attempting does, in the immediate moment, reduce a certain kind of distress. The tension of sitting with an undone task is real, but it is a known tension. The tension of beginning, of exposing oneself to the possibility of judgment or inadequacy, is unknown. And the mind, under the influence of depression, reliably chooses the known pain over the unknown one. What this creates, over time, is a reinforcing loop of exquisite precision. The task is avoided, which produces relief in the short term, which teaches the nervous system that avoidance produces relief, which makes avoidance the preferred strategy, which leads to more tasks undone, which produces more evidence for the narrative of inadequacy, which deepens the low mood, which makes the anticipated cost of attempting feel even higher, which makes avoidance even more attractive. Many observe that this loop can run for months, sometimes years, without the person inside it fully recognizing it as a loop. It feels from within like a series of individual decisions made in individual moments, each one reasonable given the circumstances, each one comprehensible in isolation. The pattern only becomes visible from a distance, and depression, by its nature, makes distance very difficult to achieve. There is something else worth noting about this mechanism, something that is often overlooked in conversations about procrastination and mood. The loop does not only affect action, it affects perception. The person inside it does not merely delay tasks, they begin to see their entire life through the filter the loop creates. Future possibilities appear smaller. Past achievements appear less significant. The present moment becomes something to be endured rather than inhabited. This perceptual narrowing is not a side effect of the loop. It is part of the loop itself, one of the ways the cycle sustains its own conditions. Understanding the mechanism does not immediately dissolve it, but it does something equally important. It removes the element of self-blame that so often adds a second layer of suffering on top of the first. The person who understands that their delay is a nervous system response to anticipated pain, operating according to its own coherent logic, is in a fundamentally different position than the person who believes their delay is evidence of a flaw in their character. And it is from that different position, that slightly more spacious, slightly less self-condemning place, that something new becomes possible. Let us now consider what this mechanism looks like when it leaves the interior world and enters the texture of an ordinary day. Chapter 3. The shape of an ordinary day. It is one thing to understand a psychological cycle in the abstract. It is another thing entirely to recognize it in the particular, in the specific unremarkable moments of a life being lived, because the quiet paralysis does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive with a clear beginning or a recognizable form. It seeps into the ordinary, reshaping it from within, until what was once a day feels like something else entirely. A performance, a postponement, a careful navigation of what can be tolerated and what cannot. Consider a specific kind of morning, not a crisis morning, not a morning of obvious distress, but an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that arrives with its own weight before the eyes are fully open. There is a moment in the first seconds of waking when the mind performs a kind of inventory. It scans forward into the day and takes quiet note of what is there. And for someone carrying the weight of this cycle, that inventory rarely produces a neutral reading. It produces something more like a faint dread, a mild but persistent awareness that the day will require things that feel, at this particular moment, slightly beyond reach. The morning unfolds in small negotiations. Breakfast takes longer than it needs to. The phone is checked, not for any particular reason, but because the mild stimulation of scrolling is more immediately accessible than the mild exertion of beginning. The commute, or the short walk to the home desk, passes in a kind of muted awareness, present in the body but not quite in the moment. The working day begins, technically but not fully. Emails are opened and closed without response. Documents are loaded and minimized. The The work itself remains patient and accumulating, just at the edge of engagement. In relationships, the shape of the cycle is different, but equally present. Texts go unanswered, not out of indifference, but out of a kind of emotional depletion that makes even small social exchanges feel like they require more than is available. Plans are made and then quietly unmade, not with explicit cancellation, but with a gradual withdrawal that leaves the other person uncertain about what happened. Conversations feel effortful in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who does not share the experience. There is a genuine desire for connection alongside a genuine incapacity to reach for it, and the gap between the two produces its own particular flavor of loneliness. In the evenings, there is often what many describe as a kind of cruel clarity. The heaviness of the daytime lifts slightly, not entirely, but enough to see the day with something approaching perspective. And what that perspective reveals is the gap between what was intended and what was done, between who one wanted to be today and who one was. This evening, clarity is not gentle. It arrives with its own cargo, self-reproach, the quiet rehearsal of everything undone, the mental drafting of tomorrow's redemption that both brings comfort and quietly deepens the pressure. What is important to understand about this daily shape is that it is not chosen. The person living inside it is not selecting their experience from a menu of options. They are responding moment by moment to the demands and signals of a system that has been calibrated by accumulated experience. The phone is not reached for because the person lacks discipline. It is reached for because, in that specific moment, the nervous system has identified it as the path of least emotional resistance. The text goes unanswered, not because the person does not care, but because something in the architecture of their current state makes caring feel different from being able to act on caring. Seeing the cycle in its daily form, in its ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday morning shape, is important precisely because it humanizes what the clinical framing can sometimes flatten. This is not a pathology happening to a person. This is a person, fully human, navigating a set of internal conditions with the resources available to them. That distinction matters enormously, both for understanding and for what comes next. This naturally leads us to ask, if the cycle is this consistent, this logical, this deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary experience, what keeps it running? What are the hidden patterns, the invisible scaffolding, that sustain it long after the conditions that originally created it have changed? Chapter 4. The Patterns That Persist. Every enduring psychological cycle has a structure beneath it, a set of beliefs, narratives, and relational habits that function like a frame, holding the cycle in place even when circumstances shift. These patterns are rarely visible from within. They operate below the level of deliberate thought, shaping perception and behavior with the quiet efficiency of deeply practiced habits. And because they are invisible, they are often the last thing addressed, even when everything else has been examined, adjusted, and refined. In the cycle of procrastination and depression, several patterns appear with remarkable consistency across different people, different lives, different circumstances. They are worth naming not to catalogue or diagnose, but to illuminate, because something seen clearly loses at least some of its power to operate unseen. The first and perhaps most pervasive is the pattern of deferred worthiness. This is the quiet, often entirely unconscious belief that feeling good about oneself, feeling worthy of rest, of connection, of pleasure, is contingent on having completed enough. Not a specific amount, because the threshold is never defined. Just more than this, more than what was done today, more than what exists currently. The person carrying this pattern lives in a perpetual future, where the conditions for self-acceptance are always just one more completed task away. And because the tasks are never fully completed, because the list replenishes itself with the efficiency of all lists, the feeling of worthiness never fully arrives. What arrives instead is either the temporary relief of having done enough today, or the familiar dull ache of having fallen short again. The second pattern is what might be called the perfectionism of inaction. This is subtly different from the perfectionism most commonly discussed. the kind that demands flawless execution of undertaken tasks. This is the perfectionism that prevents tasks from being undertaken at all, because the gap between the imperfect attempt one is capable of making and the ideal result one imagines is experienced as too painful to cross. Many observe that this pattern is particularly common in people who were once high achievers, or who received early messages that their value was closely tied to their performance. The mind that learned to equate effort with outcome and outcome with worth learns also to protect against outcomes that might contradict the desired narrative. The third pattern is the internal forecast of futility. This is the habitual scanning of future possibilities through a lens that consistently underestimates their potential. It is not pessimism in the philosophical sense, it is a perceptual habit, a way of processing incoming information about what might happen that reliably concludes in the direction of disappointment. The project imagined forward is imagined failing. The conversation anticipated is anticipated going wrong. The day ahead is pre-lived as a repetition of previous difficult days. This forecast is not experienced as a belief, which would make it more accessible to questioning. It is experienced as perception, as simply seeing things as they are, which makes it very difficult to examine and very easy to act on. The fourth pattern is perhaps the most intimate, the relationship with rest. In a cycle of procrastination and depression, rest becomes complicated. It loses its restorative quality and becomes instead either an escape or a punishment. When rest is taken amid undone tasks, it carries the weight of those tasks. It does not fully refresh because beneath the surface of the resting, the accounting continues. The person lying down in the afternoon is not truly resting. They are delaying while resting, which is its own particular kind of exhaustion. And when rest is withheld as a consequence of insufficient productivity, the body and mind are denied the very resource they would need to break the cycle. These patterns do not announce themselves. They have the quality of furniture, so familiar, so consistently present, that one stops noticing them and begins, instead, to navigate around them as though they are fixed features of the room, rather than objects that could, in principle, be moved. This is what makes the next chapter so important. Not the mechanics of moving them, but the prior question of what it actually feels like when the grip of these patterns begins, even slightly, to loosen. Chapter 5. The Loosening. There is a particular moment that many people describe, often with some difficulty finding the right words for it, that seems to mark a shift in the cycle. It is not a dramatic moment. It is rarely a revelation, rarely an epiphany, rarely the kind of turning point that makes for a satisfying narrative. It is more often a small, quiet, almost imperceptible loosening, a moment in which the weight that has been present for so long feels, for just an instant, fractionally less absolute. These moments are easy to miss. They arrive without announcement and pass quickly if they are not noticed. But in the experience of many who have moved through this cycle, they seem to share certain common qualities. They tend to occur not in the presence of achievement, not after the task is completed or the deadline met, but in the presence of something much simpler. A moment of honesty, a moment of being seen, either by another person or by oneself, without the transaction of performance. A morning walk taken not to be productive, but simply because the body wanted to move. A conversation entered not to resolve anything, but simply to be in contact with another human being. What these moments seem to have in common is the temporary suspension of the internal accounting, the brief absence of the background calculation that is always running, the one that measures current output against some ideal standard and issues its quiet verdict. When the accounting pauses even briefly, something else becomes audible. Something that was always there beneath the noise of self-evaluation, waiting with the patience of something that does not experience urgency in the same way the conscious mind does. Common human experience suggests that this loosening rarely comes from attacking the cycle directly. Efforts to simply decide to stop procrastinating, to resolve to feel better, to apply discipline to the gap between intention and action, tend to engage with the surface of the cycle without touching its roots. They add to the internal pressure, which is already, in most cases, considerable, without offering the nervous system any new information about whether it is safe to move. What tends to create new information for the nervous system is a different quality of attention toward the self. Not the critical attention that most people caught in this cycle know very well, the attention that notices every failure, catalogues every delay, and translates every undone task into evidence for a story about who they are. But a different attention, quieter and more curious, the kind that can observe the pattern without immediately attempting to correct it, the kind that can notice the loop running without immediately stepping inside it to fight. This quality of attention is not a technique to be applied. It is more like a capacity that grows gradually through practice, through the accumulation of small moments in which one observes one's own experience with something resembling the gentleness one might naturally extend to another person. Many observe that this shift in internal attention is one of the most significant things that can happen in the context of this cycle, not because it resolves anything directly, but because it changes the emotional conditions in which the cycle operates. And a cycle operating in different emotional conditions is gradually a different cycle. The loosening is not a destination. It is more accurately described as a direction, a slow reorientation of the self's relationship to its own experience, away from the posture of judgment and towards something more resembling honest companionship with one's own interior life. And as that reorientation takes hold, what begins to emerge is not a corrected version of the old life, tasks completed, mood elevated, productivity restored, but something less familiar and perhaps more valuable than any of that. Let us now consider what that something looks like when it begins to live in the texture of an actual day. Chapter 6. The Texture of a Different Life. There is a tendency, when imagining what life might look like on the other side of a long and difficult internal cycle, to imagine it as the opposite of what it currently is. If the current experience is one of paralysis, the imagined future is one of seamless movement. If the current experience is colored by low mood, the imagined future glows with consistent warmth. This imagination is understandable. It is the mind reaching toward relief, sketching a picture that provides just enough hope to keep going. But it is also, in an important way, misleading, because the life that emerges on the other side of this cycle does not look like its opposite. It looks more like a deepened version of the same life, slower perhaps and more inhabited, but recognizably continuous with everything that came before. What changes is not the content of life, but its quality. The same tasks remain, the same relationships, with their same textures of warmth and friction, the same mornings, the same desk, the same lists. What changes is the relationship to all of it, the emotional atmosphere in which the ordinary unfolds. Consider that professional who woke before the alarm, already tired, already behind. Imagine them now, not transformed into someone effortlessly productive, but slightly changed in how they meet the morning. The inventory still happens. The mind still scans forward into the day and notes what is there, but the reading of that inventory has shifted. The undone tasks are still present. The dread does not entirely disappear, but it no longer occupies the foreground with the same insistence. There is, alongside it, a small but genuine access to the moment itself. The particular quality of early morning light, the warmth of the first drink, the awareness of breath moving in and out of a body that is, in this moment, simply here. This sounds modest. In the context of what has been described throughout these chapters, the weight of the cycle, the precision of its mechanism, the depth of its roots, it sounds almost insufficient. But many observe that it is precisely this modesty that marks it as real. Grand transformations are easy to imagine and difficult to sustain. Small, genuine shifts in how one inhabits one's own experience tend to be quieter and more durable. In the texture of daily work, something else changes too. The relationship to beginning, not the act of beginning, that remains effortful, remains imperfect, remains subject to the same internal friction as before. But something in the meaning assigned to beginning shifts. The task is no longer primarily a test of worth. It becomes more simply a task, something to be done, imperfectly, with whatever is currently available, for reasons that are one's own. The distance between intention and action does not collapse entirely. It narrows in some moments to something crossable. In relationships, the shift manifests as a slight increase in presence. Not dramatic, not sudden, but a perceptible movement toward availability, toward showing up with less of oneself, held in reserve against the possibility of disappointment. The text that once sat unanswered gets answered, not always easily, but with less of the old negotiation. The conversation is entered more fully, with something closer to genuine attention. And in the evenings, those evenings that once brought that particular cruel clarity, something gentler becomes possible. The accounting still happens to some degree. The gap between intention and action is still visible, but the verdict issued by that accounting has changed in character. It is less final, less definitive, less convinced of its own authority to determine what the gap means about the person who lived the day. This is not a perfect life. It is not a resolved life. It is a life in which the cycle, still present in some form, has lost its grip on the story of who one fundamentally is. And that loss of grip, quiet, incremental, deeply earned, changes everything about how the next day begins. Before we move into our closing reflection, it is worth knowing that Stillness Audiobooks has a growing library of original audiobooks exploring themes like this one: the interior life, the mind under pressure, the slow and honest work of understanding oneself. If this journey has spoken to something in you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, so these audiobooks find their way to you as they arrive. Conclusion. Throughout these chapters, we have seen that the quiet paralysis is not a mystery without an explanation, nor a flaw without a context. We have traced it to its roots, the emotional architecture beneath the behavior, the conditions in which both procrastination and depression find their common ground. We have followed it into the mechanism of delay, that precise internal logic by which the mind under emotional weight chooses the known discomfort of avoidance over the unknown discomfort of attempting. We have watched it take shape inside an ordinary day, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a series of small negotiations, small retreats, the accumulated weight of a life lived slightly to the side of itself. We have examined the hidden patterns that sustain it, deferred worthiness, the perfectionism of inaction, the internal forecast of futility, the complicated relationship with rest. And we have sat with the loosening, the quiet, non-dramatic shift that begins not with a resolution, but with a different quality of attention toward oneself, and the texture of life that gradually, imperfectly, becomes available on the other side of that shift. What does this mean for your journey? That is not a question that can be answered here in these pages, because it belongs entirely to you, to the specific contours of your life, your history, your particular version of this experience. But perhaps it means something like this, that understanding the cycle you are in is not a detour from moving through it. It is, in many ways, the most direct path available. The mind that can see its own patterns clearly, with something approaching honesty and something approaching compassion, is already in a different relationship to those patterns than it was before. And different relationships produce, over time, different possibilities. Perhaps it also means that the days you judge most harshly, the ones where nothing was completed, where the heaviness won, where the list remained untouched, were not wasted in the way they felt. They were days in which something was being carried, with whatever resources were available, and carrying, even without visible forward movement, is its own form of endurance. The quiet paralysis is quiet in part because it is so rarely spoken about with honesty. It hides behind productivity language and self-improvement frameworks, behind the culture of relentless forward motion that makes stillness feel like failure. But in the listening to something like this, in the willingness to sit with an honest examination of what this experience actually is and how it actually works, there is already a movement. Subtle, perhaps, difficult to measure, but real. Thank you for this shared journey. If this audiobook offered you something, a recognition, a reframing, a few minutes of feeling less alone inside a very human experience, consider following the Stillness Audiobooks channel, where new original audiobooks await you each week, each one created for exactly this kind of deep and unhurried listening. End of the audiobook.